Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. When one tries to follow Lebanese politics, it is as if nothing of significance took place in Beirut, Tripoli, Baalbek, and the other cities and districts over since deep into the last century. The same names of political families and dynasties are heard now as in 2005, 1990, or even earlier. Maronite Shiite and Sunni power brokers jockey for position and enjoy the forbidden fruits of corruption, while the country sinks into an economic and social abyss. What is in the cards for Israel's poor and strife-torn neighbor to the north? To analyze this topic, we're joined from Central Israel by Ms. Paula Slier, who is the Middle East Bureau Chief at Russia Today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Also joining us from another location in Central Israel is Dr. Nir Boms, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us as well.
Good to be here.
And with me here in the studio is our TV7 analyst and host of Watchmen Talk, Mr. Amir Oren. And Amir, let's immediately dive into the country called Lebanon. What can you elaborate on this?
Well, Lebanon, and as you mentioned, the so-called country of Lebanon has gone from being an oasis into an abyss, or at least looking into the abyss, in a very chaotic situation. Now, we are trying to look at Lebanon not only in general terms, but from an Israeli perspective. And Lebanon used to be the quiet neighbor to the north until in the late 1960s, those Palestinians who were pushed from the west bank of the Jordan River into the east bank, and then had a conflict with King Hussein of Jordan, settled in Lebanon, turned it into a launching pad against Israel, and this caused two reactions. One was Israel's military forays into Lebanon, and the other was the Syrian intervention in 1975 on behalf of the Palestinians at first. And the Christians at first, against the Palestinians and their Muslim allies. And then, of course, after the Khomeini revolution, it all turned into the Amal and Hezbollah Shiite organizations' growth against the other powers in Lebanon. Just to cut the very long story short, what we have seen over the last several months was the collapse of the Lebanese economy. To give you an example, the Lebanese lira, which is supposedly pegged to the dollar, 1,500 liras to the dollar, has lost some 80 or 90% of its value. And that means that even the security forces cannot earn a decent livelihood. There's nothing to keep the country from tearing itself apart. You have Hezbollah as the strongest militia. You have outside forces such as Iran. You have France trying to broker some sort of corruption-free, technocrat-led government. And the latest is that President Aoun, who is a Maronite according to the Constitution, could not reach a compromise with Prime Minister Saad Hariri, a Sunni according to the Constitution, and the Speaker of the Parliament, Nabi Berri, again a Shiite according to the Constitution, broke ranks with Hezbollah, the organization which at times has been his partner and at times his rival.
Talking about, of course, Saad al-Hariri, the fact that he's the designate prime minister, and there is, of course, also a caretaker prime minister, Hassan Diab, who is backed by Hezbollah, while Hariri is against Hezbollah.
And there is no functioning democracy in Lebanon, because when the reasons for the blast, the horrific blast last August, were investigated by a judge, the judge was dismissed before he could name politicians as being responsible for it. So the rule of law does not apply to Lebanon.
Indeed. And unfortunately, in light of the current situation, in reference to the corona crisis, there is a challenge for a lot of journalists to travel to Lebanon. The capacity to really cover the stories is near impossible. But I'd like to ask you, Paula, specifically on this. You've traveled extensively prior to the crisis to Lebanon. You've been there also through the initial stages of the Sting campaign, as they call it. Give us a little bit of an understanding from what you have seen when you were there at the time and how things developed since.
Well, the last time I was in Beirut was in August last year, just after the port blast that saw more than 200 people killed. And certainly I can give you a sense of the growing frustration. I mean, I was also there back in 2015 covering the garbage crisis when you had millions of bags just lining the streets of Beirut full of garbage. Now, when you actually there, so for example, and I saw the explosion at the port, the government saying that it's going to cost them between 15 and 20 billion dollars to restore. The people there saying that they don't trust the government because the government is widely blamed for actually causing that blast in the first place. And the same with the garbage crisis. So there's an increasing dissatisfaction on the streets from people who simply don't believe in the government. So you have this growing, as Amir said, this growing political deadlock. You have this financial meltdown. You have rising poverty. You have that port blast. And then, of course, you have Corona. The country of Lebanon saw one of the harshest lockdowns with some 6,000 people killed. So I think what we're going to see more of is increasing numbers of people taking to the streets. It is certainly a pity that the international media isn't focused on what is happening there. But there is a growing sense of frustration amongst the public. The problem with these protests is that they're not homogenic. There's no unification, and it's really just disjointed groups taking to the streets to vent their anger and frustration. Having said that, I don't think people want another revolution, and that people are very careful not to have another civil war, but certainly the trust for the Lebanese government is at an all-time low.
Dr. Boms, how do you view it?
Well, I think it's important to look at what perhaps has changed with the demonstrations. Lebanon have seen many demonstrations. It had seen camps of demonstrations for Hezbollah and anti-Hezbollah. But what I think that's interesting in the last few weeks and months is that some of the Shia camp comprises about half of the Muslim population in Lebanon, and itself divided between the Amal movement and Hezbollah movement, have became increasingly angry with some of their leadership. There were some interesting slogans I caught in the last couple of weeks. For example, where Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, was bragging on the readiness and the missiles, and people have said, well, why don't you sell some missiles and give us something to eat? These types of slogans coming also and seen also in Shia neighborhoods are somewhat new and interesting and worthy of attention because, again, if you take the other side of it, the Maronite Patriarch El-Rai speaks about the idea of the Lebanese ethos, and that Lebanon needs to be Lebanon. It doesn't need to be controlled by another country. That country very clearly here is Iran. So this particular dynamic, along with the crisis, the currency, the economy, the COVID crisis, may produce something new. We have seen this split. And Hezbollah, who had gained forces also in the government, now potentially may lose some of its power and influence. The French plan, what Saad Hariri, the designate prime minister, the government is trying to form is a government of technocrats, government of professionals. This is also something there that Hezbollah camp very much would not like to see, because it will bring out of the government people like Hamid Hassan, the Minister of Health, or Imad Huballa, the Minister of Industry. And these are people who were able to help Hezbollah get influence and funds for different projects. They are the ones who were able to maintain their influence with financial means. All of them are being depleted. And therefore, this particular crisis may potentially be somewhat, maybe significant for future political developments. And the other piece that's worth mentioning in here is the role of Russia. Hezbollah delegation had been in Moscow 10 days ago. They were received not in honors welcome. They were asked to tone down. They were asked to, according to some reports, to take some of the missiles they have and actually bring them back to Iran. That was a message from Jerusalem. They were given the locations of their missiles, saying, look, this is already on Israel's radar. Hezbollah's delegation was not very happy, but this also shows that Russia is really the real arbitrator in the Middle East, in Lebanon, in Syria, and much beyond. Of course, for Israel, it will much rather have Lebanon under Russia than Lebanon under Iran.
Before we ask you, Paula, about the Russian angle of things with regard to this meeting, Mr. Oren, when we're talking about Lebanon, it's very sectarial. There are different denominations. Of course, you have the Sunnis and Muslims, Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims, which comprise the largest amount of Lebanese population residing in Lebanon at this stage, seconded, of course, by the Maronite Christians. But just to give a glimpse of the complexities, if you just look at the Rafik al-Hariri International Airport, which is named after the slain prime minister assassinated by a Hezbollah operative just a decade and a half ago, approximately, for being too anti-Iranian and too anti-Hezbollah. And then from that airport, the highway going into Beirut and crossing Beirut is called Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. So you suddenly have the same person who started the Islamic Revolution and pushed for Iran to advance its revolutionary ideal throughout the region and throughout the world, for that matter. How is that complexity actually being monitored and dealt with, not only by Israel, but by also Western powers and Eastern powers, as we hear also Russia being involved?
Well, the makeup of Lebanon is indeed impossible. It all started under the Ottomans, and the unification of the Beirut district with other parts of Lebanon, the anti-Lebanon mountains, the Shuf district, the Bekaa, and the poor southern part of Lebanon. This was illogical, and it diluted the homogeneity of Beirut. Now, this is probably irreversible. We are a long way from trying to undo it. And therefore, they are still going to be at each other's throats. And only a very powerful ruler of the Hafez Assad kind, not to mention other more remote tyrants like Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, could rule Lebanon with an iron hand from the outside. Left to its own devices, Lebanon cannot function, cannot rule itself. And you have this mix of, I'm already asking for Paula's permission because I'm going to list off several terms starting with P. It's politics, population, propaganda, prestige, and the precision-guided munitions that Hezbollah wants. And against that, you have poverty. People are going very, very poor now. They don't have the money to buy foodstuff. The bank accounts were blocked, and the country is on the verge of collapse. And when someone from outside, such as President Macron, tries to come in and sort it out, those politicians who have a lot to lose are blocking his move into Lebanon. So something has to give. On other occasions, one would say the army would probably intervene the way it did in 1958 when General Shihab became the president. But now Hezbollah is much stronger than the Lebanese armed forces. So this is not going to happen.
Indeed, which talking, of course, about France and international support, prerequisite upon, of course, significant reform, which is necessary in order to bring about change and save Lebanon.
But,
considering also since this year's projection for 2021, we're speaking about 45% of all essential businesses going bankrupt.
Right, and another P is Palestine. There is no reason for the Lebanese to fight for Palestine when they can hardly survive on their own. And it's a pity that they don't reach a compromise with Israel on the water conflict, on the Mediterranean economic zone. We could have shared the gas resources there, and it's really only Hezbollah for reasons which have nothing to do with the welfare of the Lebanese, which is blocking it.
Talking about the meeting in Moscow, Paula, what can you tell us about it? Were there concrete demands from Moscow towards the Iranian-backed militia, considering the fact that obviously the Russian Federation is looking about the wider picture here, which is to safeguard the Assad regime from total collapse?
Well, firstly, the meeting took place earlier this month, and we're certainly seeing a situation where Hezbollah is in a weakened position. It was mentioned earlier that it's also losing popular support on the streets of Lebanon. So the question is being asked whether or not Russia is able to use Hezbollah to present it as a much stronger king player in terms of what is happening in Lebanon. Lebanon is important for Russia because you can think of it as being an extension of Russia's interests in Syria. So, for example, you had your Russian army fighting alongside your Lebanese Hezbollah fighters in Syria to prop up the government of the Syrian president Bashar Assad. This instability that is happening currently in Lebanon is not necessarily a bad thing for Russia. And to that extent, we do see that the Russians are taking advantage of it. Not necessarily that the Russians would want to see the collapse or not want to see the collapse of the government. They certainly feel that the protests are also being motivated by Western interests. I do want to make the point that France is very involved in what is happening in Lebanon. And recently, France has been pursuing closer relations with Moscow, with Russia. And France certainly wants to see the Russians come to the party and see a peaceful outcome to what is happening. It's widely expected that President Putin will pay lip service to this. It's not necessarily in his interest to see the Lebanese government collapse. I mean, the Russian policy has always been against seeing that kind of thing happen, partly because it could trigger it happening in Russia, and also because it believes in legitimate governments hanging on to their seats and change only coming through the vote. We don't know exactly what were the demands that were placed on Hezbollah, but certainly we have a situation that Moscow is playing an increasingly more important role in Lebanon, and it's certainly a role that it welcomes.
Indeed. Dr. Boms, let's bring Turkey into the mix. Right after the blast that occurred in the port of Beirut, we saw multiple trips by various Turkish officials coming, including Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, the vice president who went there, and other individuals who really sought to offer Turkish assistance, not only to Lebanon as a whole, but to the Sunni Muslim communities. They are seeking in a certain degree to replace possibly Saudi Arabia. How do you see that?
Well, the Turkish attempts are not new. President Erdogan attempts to solidify Turkey as a regional force. It had seen a number of obstacles, not involved in the Turkish economy and the sanctions that really created a scenario in where he had lost a lot of his currency. But still, there are opportunities, and losing ally after ally, finding additional allies in Lebanon is something that the Turkish president would like to pursue. This is also maybe very interesting in the context of the broader geopolitical picture that we're drawing here. Because if the Turks will assist the Sunni and then in turn will create a coalition that will further weaken the Hezbollah camp, that potentially may help a shift in Lebanon. And if the Turkey will be perceived as playing a more positive role along, let's say, that one that is played by the French, that may get at least President Erdogan some points vis-a-vis his very turbulent relationships with Europe. I don't think this dynamic is the most important within the context that we are describing here, but it certainly exists. And we always need to remember that Turkey is there to stay, and that President Erdogan is not going to lose an opportunity to assert and exert influence and power.
Mr. Oren, where does the United States come into this whole conundrum of challenges? Is it really remaining at the level of just remarks and statements from press briefing rooms in Washington, or is it actually working also on the ground? And to what degree are the Israelis coordinated on this matter through their American counterparts, considering the fact that the maritime dispute with Lebanon was also brokered by the United States under the previous administration of the former President Donald Trump?
Well, when you look at what the Biden administration has been doing in the first 2 months of its existence, it has put domestic policies ahead of foreign policy. It has put diplomacy ahead of warfare, the Far East ahead of the Near East or the Middle East, and it is yet to formulate a policy vis-a-vis the region. Perhaps it is waiting for a stable Israeli government in order to do it. It has not focused yet on any of the region's problems, perhaps except for Yemen. And then they drove very hard to the Saudis the point that human rights take precedence to strategic interests.
Which, to the dismay of the Biden administration, even though the Saudis seemingly acquiesced to the request with, of course, the announcement of the new Saudi-led initiative, let's call it that way, by means of the United Nations, still the war in Yemen is devastating, and the Houthis are not budging anywhere with Iranian support to add.
Lebanon is far down the list of possible agenda items for Biden. It has not yet had the attention span to include Lebanon. Perhaps if tomorrow it is formally declared a failed state, perhaps if there is a civil war or famine or some other catastrophe, it will deal with it. But for the time being, it is not on anyone's radar.
Not enough PR to be gained here. Ms. Slier, looking at Lebanon right now, what is the main challenge you would like to point at, and how to deal with that challenge, considering all the various points of discussion we just led?
I think the most urgent thing that needs to happen is for a new government to be formed. I mean, you have essentially 7 months that we haven't seen any kind of movement on that. And there was recently a meeting between the president and the Prime Minister Hariri. And Hariri is pushing for some kind of technocratic government. We have President Aoun, who has his own candidates that he's putting forward, and Hariri is countering that by saying he wants to form some kind of minority force that can veto any kind of developments. And then you have the growing sentiment on the street with people saying this political bickering is not actually achieving anything. At the same time, I want to make a point about Hezbollah. I think Hezbollah is choosing to rather manage the situation and the conflict rather than resolve it. It, of course, is watching what is happening with Iran, which supplies it with its funds, and the administration of Joe Biden, and whether or not there is going to be a resumption of the talks. And of course, that will impact just how much money Hezbollah receives from Iran in terms of which it can operate. We're looking at a country that really could soon become a failed state. And I think that this story needs to be more on the front line and in the headlines, because you have a situation where you're not just talking about what happens domestically in terms of Lebanon, but in terms of how that will impact the region and countries further afield.
Dr. Boms, your take on where things may be heading from here and what should be done. Of course, the challenges of receiving enough international or becoming part of the international stage at this point. We heard, of course, in last informal meeting of the European Commission's foreign ministers meeting. We heard Jean-Yves Le Drian, the French foreign minister, urging EU member states to raise Lebanon and bring it on the agenda, something that doesn't really seem to take hold within the interests of the international community at this stage.
We've heard this before. Lebanon has been a bit under the radar. The international community in the past year has been busy with other issues. But I think if I were to focus on one important obstacle that Lebanon has, this is Hezbollah. This is the obstacle for the maritime border agreement, which could have certainly in the medium and long term march Lebanon's economy together. This is the obstacle that prevents the creation of a government that will be able to bring bring Lebanon out of this crisis. And this is also the Iran dimension, which, of course, the Europeans, the Americans, not to mention the Israelis and the Arab Sunni states are pushing, and now along with the Russians, to diminish their weight and influence, and in that sense to diminish Hezbollah's impact over there. This is the real battle over Lebanon. And the Lebanese, some of the Lebanese figures, certainly not from the Hezbollah side, have said, are we going to lose Lebanon, or are we going to become Lebanese? They've even said, and this is the Maronite patriarch, that other countries in the neighborhood, referring south to Israel and then to the Gulf, had pursued their conflicts using diplomatic means. Why can we not do that? Of course, that's not the Hezbollah way. If that movement will gain traction, then Lebanon could take a step, and I think it will be on the radar of both the Europeans, the Americans, and the moderate Sunni states, who will be very happy to help Lebanon move forward once this obstacle called Hezbollah is out of the way.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Ms. Slier, Dr. Boms, as well as Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.